Okay, everyone, here we are, our first attempt at a lesson. I'm using my iPad and some interesting technology here that I'm not quite familiar with, so bear with me. But we're going to begin with genetics. Okay, to start, we're going to talk about a gentleman by the name of Gregor Mendel. I think he's first on your concept list. I'm going to show you a picture of him here if I can. Give me a second. Right here. There's what he looks like. Gregor Mendel. He was born in Austria. You can see how he lived from 1882 to 1884. So much of the work that Mendel did was long before we knew anything about genes and DNA and those kinds of things. So he did this from a point of view without really knowing what was going on deep inside the cells, but just by looking at the external traits or the external characteristics of something. So Gregor Mendel, he actually was a monk, believe it or not, and that's him. He's considered to be the father of genetics, and we often refer to genetics as Mendelian genetics because of that. All right, so Gregor Mendel. Now, what he noticed is that there are things called traits, right? Traits are simply characteristics. So when we see the word traits, what you have to just think about is characteristics. Sorry, the writing's a little messy. I'll get better at this, I'm sure. In humans, we have all kinds of characteristics. Traits can be physical, but they can also be behavioral. So a physical trait would be, for instance, the color of your hair. That's a trait. Hair color. Could also be, sorry. One second. Gotta go back. I told you I'm not very good at this yet. Okay, here we go. A physical trait could also be something like your length of your fingers. Some people have long fingers or short fingers. Your height is a physical trait. So you can imagine all kinds of things that we would call physical traits. We can also have what are called behavioral traits. Let's move that up a little bit. Behavioral traits are things like, how you react to a certain situation, reactions, emotional states. You might notice that, your mother or father has a certain, what we call like a tic, or a tic is basically somebody who maybe wrinkles their nose a certain way or blinks a certain way when they're speaking, and you might notice that you've inherited this and you do the same thing. So these are also traits, any kind of a characteristic. All right, so that's on our list. Now, Mendel worked primarily with something simple. So he worked with pea plants. Sorry, the P got cut off there. That's a P. Pea plants, which are just what you think they are. And what he noticed is that peas come in two different colors. They come in green and they come in yellow. Here's a picture, just for kicks. Okay. If you look on the right side of your screen, you can see the green peas. And if I flick to this picture, you can see that some of them are yellow. And that's a trait. And he thought that's interesting. Now, what's interesting, though, is that when he started to try to breed them, what he did is he did what's called a cross. A cross is when you simply breed one individual with another. So that's simple enough. So he decided to see what would happen if he took a yellow pea and he bred it. In other words, he would have to, be very careful to collect the proper pollen, cross it very carefully under controlled conditions. And when he did that, he would find that if he took a yellow, and we often write it with just a cross like that, yellow cross yellow means we've bred a yellow pea with a yellow pea. And you'd expect that what you would get from this is another yellow pea. And that's usually what happened. And in fact, if they did this over many generations, and they kept getting yellow peas over and over again, they had a name for that. They called that true breeding or true bred. That's also, I think, on your concept list. If something is true bred, it simply means that they are going to produce the same trait over and over and over and over and over again. But he also noticed something different. He noticed that sometimes a yellow crossed with another yellow had a chance of producing some green. Or a green crossed with a green might have had a chance to produce some yellow. And he thought, well, that's strange. Why does that happen? How is it possible that you can get a yellow from two greens, especially if he's already determined that the greens were true breeding and the yellows were true breeding? So this created all kinds of problems. So Mendel would go out in his garden and he would do these experiments. He would try to figure out what was going on with the pea plants. Well, he noticed something. He noticed that it wasn't just random. He noticed that he would get specific ratios. So different crosses, like for instance, a yellow with a green and then a green with a yellow, or a yellow with another yellow. Maybe he did a true bred yellow with a yellow that he wasn't sure of, or a true bred green. He just tried a whole bunch of different combinations. And what he found was that different crosses resulted in specific ratios of green and yellow peas. So in other words, it wasn't just a random green pea every so often. He found out that if he did it 100 times, then 25% of them would come out, say, green, which is weird because that happened repeatedly over and over and over. So he realized that there must be something going on inside the peas. There must be some way that the peas were transferring this yellow and green nature or trait to their offspring. Okay? So he decided to coin a term. He said that there must be something inside each pea plant that can be passed on to future generations. And he didn't know what this was. He called it a factor. A factor. So that's on your list. That's what he meant. He just meant there must be something inside there that can be passed on. And he had no idea what it was or what it might take the shape or form of. Today, we've researched this much further. And in the almost 200 years since he did this, we've discovered that a factor is really the same thing as a gene. And we're going to talk more about that in subsequent lessons later on. But for now, he just called it a factor. So you'll probably hear me use the term interchangeably because, we live in the 21st century, so we often will say gene instead of factor. But Mendel didn't know anything about genetics yet, so that's what he called it. And he noticed something else, something quite neat. Some factors seemed to mask or hide other factors. And this is very important. So he had a name. He said that he called them dominant and recessive. A dominant factor would always mask or hide a recessive factor. And then, after doing more studies and more studies, he came to the conclusion that traits are controlled by a pair of factors. I'll even see if I can erase that. Look at how good I'm getting. Okay, a pair of factors. So it wasn't just a case of 1 or 10 or 2. There's always 2. There's always 2 factors. So that means that there are combinations you can get. You could get a dominant factor and another dominant factor. But you might also get a dominant factor and a recessive factor, or the other combination is 2 recessive factors. Now, where do you get these factors? Well, he realized that they were passed on from the parents. So they had to have something to do with the gametes. Now, you'll recall that we've learned about gametes. Gametes are produced by meiosis, and they are haploid, which means they contain only 1/2 of the genetic complement of a diploid individual. So now you can kind of see where this is going. If your full genetic makeup contains a double copy, do you remember how we said that the genes had 2 versions, right? 2 people who were firemen, 2 people who were doctors, 2 people who were lawyers to do all the jobs. So that diploid number meant you had 2 versions of each chromosome. Well, during meiosis, that means that those 2 versions are split apart. And so in one gamete, you produce one version here, and the other gamete gets the other version. Now you can see that those versions are exactly what Mendel was thinking about. Those versions were the dominant or recessive forms of the factors that were inside of you, that were being passed on through the gametes. So he has a name for these. He calls them alleles. So an allele is a form of a factor or a gene that comes in 2 types. It's either dominant or recessive. What's more, let me draw a little picture here. So let's say that inside your cells there's a particular trait. Okay? So you have a combination. Maybe you have 2 dominant versions of the trait. When you produce gametes by meiosis, you will produce gametes that have only the dominant version. But someone else who has a mix of the dominant and the recessive version, when they do meiosis, they would produce a dominant and possibly also some recessives. So remember, if this is the boy, actually this is the girl, and this is the boy over here, there we go. Well, these are eggs, and these are sperms. That's what meiosis does. It produces the eggs and the sperms. So let's look at these 4 and see how they might combine. So for instance, if you made these eggs and these sperms, one was D and one was R, well, now you can just look at the combinations. You could have these 2, and you could have an individual that was born when that egg met that sperm, and it would carry the dominant and recessive version. Or you could have this D combining with this D, and it could carry this version. Or this D and this recessive version. Or this one. So there's basically two possible outcomes, but if you look at the four combinations, there's two that are both dominants, and there's two that are dominant and recessive. So he started to play with all these combinations, and he started to realize that these combinations, this is a 50-50 ratio, isn't it? There's 50% of the outcomes are one thing and 50% of the outcomes are another. And these ratios that you get were matching precisely with what he was observing when he was crossing these plants. So we've got our concept list pretty much all taken care of. We've talked about everything in class 1. So I'm just going to do a very quick review, put it all into perspective, and this is the end of class 1. All right, so Gregor Mendel realized that traits are controlled by factors. And we're going to write the word genes in there because we know what that means. Each factor comes in two types, either dominant or recessive. And of course, you have to remember that the dominant, maybe I'll write that, dominant masks recessive, masks or hides recessive. All right, so there's the factors, there's the traits, there's the dominant, the recessive, and each variation is called an allele. An allele. All right, so that concludes lesson number 1. So hopefully that starts to put all of those concepts into place. In the next lesson tomorrow, we're going to look at how he kept track of and how he started to work out. We're going to do a little bit of, it's all going to have nice little charts and graphs and things that we're going to use to try to figure out how these things might work. So that's it for today. Get all that into your head, write it out, think about it, talk about it, keep it fresh in your mind. The problem with sort of online learning is that it's all up to you. So you can learn as much as you want or as little as you want. And you're really going to have to put that push on to get all this into your heads and understand it. Feel free to Google things, to check things out online, to read about Gregor Mendel, and so a lot of this will sort of develop a context, right, that you can understand it in. Okay, so that's it for today. Thanks for watching.